Given the connection between Silicon Valley Bank and tech,
Yeah.
I said to him, what should we learn about the plan for renewal given what's going on there? Does that teach us anything? This is what he said.
What's happening within the SVB right now and the regional banks, I think it's indicative of a different problem, if I could say that, which is you've had 10 years of reckless behavior, excessive spending, which has been accelerated over the last 2 years under the Biden administration, where we're spending well beyond our means, and excess in terms of low interest rates. And those two things have created an asset liability mismatch that got reflected and clear to all the moment the Fed jacked up interest rates. The purpose of that obviously was to fix the problem that they had created with inflation. And you have Silicon Valley Bank, of the banks, probably the most terribly mismanaged. And so I don't look at the Silicon Valley Bank as indicative of any sort of reflection on our tech industry in general. I view it as an example of a poorly managed bank that was terribly regulated by the San Francisco Fed and a broader macro problem.
You mentioned that at least apparently there was some mismanagement at Silicon Valley Bank. One of the themes in your plan of renewal is less regulation, not more regulation. How do you square that with what we're seeing right now? By the way, with Silicon Valley Bank, but also I could even extend it to a train derailment in Pennsylvania, in Ohio.
Yeah, well listen, there's no doubt that the government needs to play a role in protecting the safety of our citizens in very targeted, thoughtful, balanced ways. And so East Palestine's a great example of that, where we certainly don't have the right regulatory regime, and the government needs to play a role. By the way, it's also an example of where, and this is what I saw on the campaign trail with many Pennsylvanians, where there's a whole part of our country that's being left behind that people don't even show up when there's a train wreck. And so that whole situation is indicative of a misguided level of government involvement. But on balance, the government's been far too prone to be proactive with regulation and far too not eager enough, I guess, to roll back regulation. Let me give you an example of that. One of the things I liked about President Trump's idea of for every new regulation put in, you have to take away two, is that there's an inertia within the bureaucracy to regulate. And you see that with the growth of regulations in the administrative state. And I saw this in Pennsylvania with fracking. Fracking has made incredible technological strides in terms of protecting the environment, protecting the health, and the regulations around fracking essentially make it very difficult to get natural gas out of the ground in Pennsylvania, despite that it would be good for the environment, despite it's great for the economy, and despite it's great for our national security. And when you ask who's behind this and why, there's this labyrinth regulatory process that makes it impossible. So smart regulation, yes. There probably, I don't know if it's regulation, there certainly should have been much better regulatory oversight with Silicon Valley Bank. The San Francisco Federal Reserve had to be sleeping at the switch. What happened was so obvious, right? You have this bank that has deposits from very concentrated, highly volatile depositors, and you have a balance sheet where they've invested long in treasuries, and when interest rates spike, they're underwater. That was so obvious for a bank regulator to see if they were doing their job. So in this case, it wasn't the lack of regulation, it was the lack of oversight, and they didn't do a good job.
So the U.S. government, as you say, the core thing is basic R&D, which we've fallen behind, and you talk about in your book. But there isn't enough money in the U.S. government to fully fund everything that needs to get done.
Private capital.
It's got to be private capital.
Yeah.
What can or should the federal government do to facilitate that private capital?
Yeah, well, that's the key part of the book around technology leadership. And essentially, I make the case that we can't have a China model where we have the state-owned enterprises and that sort of thing. We can't be China. We don't want to be China. We also can't be what many on the left propose, which is to have industrial policy where the government's in the middle of picking companies. In some ways, that's some of the problems with the CHIPS Act. The government's putting money into specific companies and putting specific ties and obligations on top of it. What we need to do is put the government in a position where it's through incentives, tax rebates, or capital that is first loss and maybe capped in a return, that drives private capital into industries that make the most sense. Let me give you an example of how that might work. We have the idea in the book about a fund where the government would co-invest along with private investors. But the government would take first loss, and the government would cap its return at 15%. What that does, it puts government capital at risk, but it puts it at risk driving private sector capital to something that really matters. It doesn't pick companies. It's not as susceptible to cronyism and all those sorts of things. And this is an important point because it runs counter to what we as traditional conservatives would have thought of, or I as a traditional conservative would have thought of. And so that's why in the book I have that section, which you may remember, which says, what would Milton Friedman think? Yeah. And Milton Friedman probably wouldn't like what I'm proposing.
Yeah, which brought you up short, actually, when they asked you that.
Exactly. And what I said to, what I say in the book is, well, what would Milton Friedman say to the fact that we're losing this battle and that we need to adopt to our circumstances to win the battle for global primacy?